All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jessica McClellan, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's presentation, PPP Loan Forgiveness Application and Calculator, a step-by-step walkthrough. During the presentation, we ask that all listeners remain in a listen-only mode. We ask that you please keep your cameras off to reduce disruption. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation using questions submitted via the chat feature. In addition, we do have a member of our PPP Loan Task Force answering questions live during the session via the chat feature. To ask a question at any time, please go ahead and submit your question in the chat feature in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Type your question into the dialog box and then click the send button. When you submit your questions, please make sure that you select host, or you can submit to the entire group. We'll try to get through as many questions as we can at the end of the session. Finally, so that we can adequately cover today's topic, including examples of FTE and compensation reductions, as well as taking your questions, this webinar is scheduled for up to 90 minutes. If you were unable to attend the entire webinar, you may view the recording of the webinar with a link at the end. We will be sending out a link with an email with the link to the recording. So let's begin. While the Paycheck Protection Program was established to help small businesses recover from the after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, it has left many owners overwhelmed as a result of the ever-changing guidance. On June 16th, the Small Business Association, in collaboration with the U.S. Treasury, released a Paycheck Protection Program Loan Forgiveness Calculator, an updated version. Today, we're going to walk through this revised version along with our WVC Loan Forgiveness Calculator to provide clarity and guidance so you can make the most of your funds while maximizing your forgiveness. With us today, we have Kate Matz, a partner in the firm's Firm Advisory Services Practice Leader. In addition, Kate is the firm's PPP Task Force Lead and the creator of our Forgiveness Calculator. In addition to Kate, we have Mike Hampf, a tax partner who will be helping to answer your questions live during the webinar. With that, I pass it over to Kate.
Thanks, Jessica. Welcome, everybody. So as Jessica mentioned, we're talking about the full form for forgiveness today. The application, as well as how you can use our WVC calculator to help with all of the data gathering and inputs and calculations and comparisons that are needed to fill out that application. So we'll walk through the application, walk through our calculator. We'll run an example through using kind of a fake company and look at some different scenarios of how FTE reductions and how compensation reductions flow through the calculation and impact things. And then, as Jessica said, we'll kind of wrap it up with any remaining questions that are outstanding that we don't get to during the discussion. So I'm going to start out first by just walking through at a really high level the application, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at the calculator. But I think if you kind of see the application first, if you haven't really spent any time looking at it yet, that will help you understand how the calculator is put together. So I've got the application up here, and this first page at the top goes through some general information on your business and on your loan. Like I said, we'll get into more details as we go. I'm just going to kind of do a high-level overview at the moment. Down at the bottom section, then, you've got the high-level calculations. This is where all the summary information is going to come together on what goes into your forgiveness. And then that bottom line is going to be the actual amount of forgiveness that you'll be applying for. Page 2 is a bunch of certifications that you'll have to initial. So you'll read through all of these, and basically they're just all getting at you're certifying that the information that you are providing, the documentation and the various statements that you're making with respect to if you had decreases in employees or not, that those are all true, accurate, complete, to the best of your knowledge that they're not fraudulent statements. So you will definitely want to make sure that you read through all of those and get comfortable with that. And you'll sign and date at the bottom. Page 3 then is where we really start having some differences compared to the easy application. So the easy application, those first 2 pages look pretty much the same, just a couple of additional lines on this full form. But these next few pages are not included in the easy application at all. So this is kind of what makes the full form the full form. This Schedule A then takes that kind of next layer down look at some of these numbers. So you'll have the cash compensation and FTEs and some wage information coming into play here for your employees that made less than $100,000 last year. Then in this next section where it talks about Table 2 totals, you're going to have some of that same information for your employees that made more than $100,000 in 2019. As you go down then, we've got the non-cash compensation, so your health insurance, retirement plans, and your SUTA. Finally, your compensation to owners, and that'll be your total payroll cost. Those total payroll costs, then that's what rolls up to that first line on the first page. So like I said, that Schedule A is kind of going that next layer deep into those numbers. So you're breaking out by over 100,000, less than 100,000, and owners. At the bottom of that page then, there are a few questions about whether you meet some FTE safe harbors. So there's a couple of safe harbors that are currently in effect, and those go through if you meet those. The next page then is yet another layer down. So you kind of start at the summary level, go down a little bit deeper. Now we're going down to even more detail here with these Schedule A worksheets. And you've got a Table 1 worksheet and a Table 2 worksheet. Your Table 1 worksheet, this is where you're going to list out each and every employee, name, identifier, their compensation, FTEs, and if there were any reductions. And then again, those kind of roll up into Schedule A, and then those roll up into that first page. Table 2, similarly, you'll list out each and every employee that made over $100,000 in 2019, some additional information on them. At the bottom of this page is some additional information on how the FTE Safe Harbor 2 works. So it walks you through step by step what that calculation looks like. Now, when you really do this, you're going to be filling it out person by person. So again, this is where the calculator really comes in, really is handy because it does all of that math for you in those different comparisons. The last page of the application then is just some demographic information. It's optional. So this is where the government can gather some statistics as far as who actually received the loans, what kind of businesses they were or ownership they had. So if you want to provide that information, further statistics, go ahead. If you don't, that is optional and you can skip over that. So it is a 4-page application with that one optional component. So let's take a tour now of the forgiveness calculator, and we can start looking at how that will help you fill out the application. So to get to the calculator, you'll want to navigate to WVCO.com. That will pull up our website. And then in the center of the page, you'll see the link to the COVID-19 Resource Center. So open that up. Once you get here, we've got quite a few different resources on COVID-19 and specifically the CARES Act. So different blogs that we've posted, FAQs linking back to the AICPA, some additional information. So helpful place to go. This is also probably where you signed up for our webinars. And then newly launched today, we started a WVC Shorts video series. So these will be short videos, approximately 5 minutes, give or take, and we'll tackle one specific question in each one of those. So our first one is on the question, do I qualify to use the EZ PPP loan forgiveness application? So we will focus on the full application today. If you're not sure whether you might be eligible for the EZ application, navigate back to this page, watch that video. That will kind of help guide you. And then as always, reach out to us with some additional questions if you have any. But right now we're looking at the loan forgiveness calculator. So you click on that button here. That will bring you to our calculator page. And on our calculator page, we do note the last date that it was updated. So as new guidance comes out, we will update the calculator to reflect any of those changes. And then as we're getting feedback from people like you that are going through and using it, and you're finding situations that it doesn't quite work for, or maybe just an additional feature that would be helpful, we've been incorporating a lot of those as well. So you can check back here and you can always see what that last recent updated date is. Click on the orange button and that will download the calculator. So we'll give it just a second here to open up. All right, so once the calculator opens, you are going to be asked if you want to enable editing, which you will. And then it's also going to ask if you want to enable the macros, which again, you will want to do that. Otherwise, certain features might not work out so well for you. So quick tour of this before we get into our company example. So when it opens up, it will open up when you first download it to this instructions tab. That's because we really want you to read the instructions. It does kind of help you understand how it's put together and what you're looking at with some of it. But if we do pop back one tab to the updates, this can be helpful to look at as well. So each time we release a new calculator version, we are noting what the new features are, what the changes are that are incorporated into that release. So if you've got an old version and you can tell what version you're on by looking at the top here, they're dated, you're able to kind of see what has changed from that last version that you've been working on. Then you've got a bunch of tabs that are in this kind of salmon color, and they are labeled 1 through 8. So you should fill those out in order 1 through 8. It will work out a lot easier for you that way. They kind of build on each other, and some of the information that it's looking for in later tabs will be based off of your inputs in the earlier tabs. So if you jump into the middle, you might actually spend time filling out things that you don't need to fill out. And some of the things might not make sense as far as the dates and stuff. So a lot of that's all kind of driven off of things that you input early. So start at 1 and work your way through over to the right. So let's go back to that instructions and take a look at what we have here. So top section is some general company information. We'll come back to that as we work through our example. In the middle, we've got several links here. So one is a link back to our calculator page on our website. Again, really suggest that you periodically check back in, make sure that you do have the most recent version so that you have all of the changes and guidance that have coming out, that all that's incorporated in the calculator version that you're using. Down here then, we've got links to the SBA loan forgiveness application instructions, as well as the application itself. And then over to the right to the EZ instructions and the EZ calculation, or the EZ application. Below that then, we've got a couple of keys that'll be helpful. So this first part here talks about the different tabs. So all the tabs that are in the salmon color, that indicates that, that those tabs have something that either requires your input, or you should at least look at and consider if you have something to input there. The gray tabs are going to indicate that you do not need to input anything on that tab. And that'll be based off of, again, information you input earlier on. Now, for you folks that are filling out the full form, you're unfortunately going to need to fill out all the tabs. You're not going to have any gray tabs. But if you were eligible for using the EZ application, a couple of the tabs would turn gray. The bright blue tabs then, these are tabs that are going to mirror that first page and then that Schedule A of the application. And those will just go down line by line exactly the amounts that you need to translate over to the application form. And then the final kind of dark blue, gray tab colors here, these are tabs that are actually going to be details to those worksheets that we looked at on the application. I'm just gonna see if I can flip back there real quick. So on that final page of the application where you're listing out each and every one of your employees, there's only a handful of line items here. So if you've got more employees than what this application form has spaces for, you're going to need to have an attachment that you'll print out and put on the back here. So that's what those tabs are. Those will actually prepare that attachment for you. You can just hit print and attach to the back of your application. This next section then is the color coding for the cells within the tabs. Follows along with the same sort of methodology. Salmon colored cells require an input from you, or at least the thought of, do I need to put something in here? Gray means that it's not applicable. You don't need to fill out anything there based off of other information that you have input. And then white cells are calculated fields. So you'll only be able to change the cells that are that salmon color. The rest, either you don't need to put anything in, or they're going to be locked because those will be calculating from other areas. All right, so that's kind of the overview of the application and then how the calculator is designed and set up to work through that. Let's take a look now at our example. Second here. Okay, so let's walk through an example of Company C, and we'll say Company C is an S Corp, and they had 11 employees during their covered period. They did have one employee that retired at the end of 2019. Now they did have some reductions in the hours that their employees were working. And they also had some salary and wage reductions. Some of them were more than 25%. They got a PPP loan of $150,000 that they received on 5/4. So let's plug them into this calculator and kind of see what we come up with here. So we've got Company C, and loan amount received was $150,000. We'll say that the date that their loan number was assigned by the SBA was 5/1. Proceeds received on 5/4. And then filling it out right now. So if their proceeds were received on 5/4, that's the start of their covered period. And they're not all the way through their covered period. So they're going to be kind of looking at this, some actual information and some estimated information. And they're going to say, all right, let's estimate that we're going to submit our forgiveness application on 12/15. Come over here to the alternative payroll covered period. They're going to use that, and we'll say that starts on 5/11. And they're going to use the 24-week covered period. So that's all we need to fill out here on tab 1. Flip over to tab 2. And again, tab 2 is our easy application criteria tab. So this includes each of the 3 criterion to determine if you're eligible for the easy application. We're going to assume that the answer is no for today, and actually our fact pattern for Company C tells us that. So high level, in order to be eligible for the easy application, you can't have any reductions in your FTEs, and you can't have more than a 25% reduction in compensation. There are some exceptions here for the FTEs. So if you think you might be eligible for the easy application, I do encourage you to go back, watch that other video, and check that out. But for now, we'll put no in these boxes. And just to show you, if we did say yes to one of them, this would change to yes, we were eligible. And here we'd have a couple of tabs that we wouldn't need to fill out. And then some other information on these other tabs would be gray that we wouldn't need to deal with either. But we're going to say that our company C is no, they don't meet any of these criteria to be an easy application filer. So move on to tab 3, and this is where we start really getting into the details of inputting information. So tab 3 is the inputs for table 1 for that Schedule A worksheet. So these are our employees who in 2019 made less than $100,000, and we look at that based on taking the one pay period in 2019 where they made the most money and annualizing that out for the full year. So if when you take that one pay period, annualize it for the full year, if that's over $100,000, they're going to go on a different tab. If it's under $100,000, they're going to go here on this tab 3. So we've got a couple of different options for FTE calculation methods that we can use, a standard method and a simplified method. We'll go ahead and use the standard method for this example. You can plug all your information in and then toggle back and forth between these two to see which one is the most favorable for you. We also have a question here as to whether we had salary or wage reductions more than 25%. So if we did not, we'd see that we've got a couple of columns here that become gray, and we would not need to fill these out. In our case, our fact pattern said that we did have some that were more than 25%, so we'll leave that as yes. So we're going to come down here and start plugging in our information employee by employee. So I've got a cheat sheet over here where I'm going to do some copying and pasting so you guys don't have to get bored watching me type. So I plugged in here 10 employees, their identifiers, and then if they're salary or hourly. This identifier column is important because some of these tabs are actually going to be looking at and comparing the information that you're entering by employee on the various tabs, and it uses this identifier to match that up. So you want to make sure that you plug in that identifier and then you've got it accurate through the tabs so that it knows how to match up those employees. All right, the next column then is cash compensation. And this cash compensation, this refers to the dollars that were either paid to those employees or that were incurred for those employees but haven't been paid yet. They'll be paid during the next pay period during this alternative payroll covered period. So if we would go back to that very first tab, we said their alternative payroll covered period is going to start on 5/11, and this calculates out for us. It'll go through 10/25. So this is white, so it's a calculated field. We're not going to be able to plug anything in here. So we're actually going to put this information in off to the right, and this has a column for each week. So you could actually go in and put in the amounts that you're paying week by week or every other week or semi-monthly, whatever your payroll cycle is, but you could plug in your actuals as you go and then make some forecasts for information if you're kind of trying to do some planning and track it that way. For purposes of what we're doing today, I'm just going to put in the total amount for the whole period in this first column. But again, you might find it helpful to use as a tracker. So now we can see that those amounts have all come over into this cash compensation column. Next column then is the average hours paid per week. And this is where we're going to start looking at our FTE information. So average hours paid per week for each of these employees. And again, it's during this whole alternative payroll covered period. So this is something that you're going to have to calculate offline, off on a side calculation, and then plug the results into here. And what you'll do is for each of your employees, you're going to list out how many hours they're getting paid for each and every week throughout that full 24 weeks. Total it up, and you're going to divide that by the 24 weeks times 40 hours per week. And that will get you the average hours, or sorry, actually that's going to get you your average FTE. But you're going to come up first with this average hours per week. So let me bring that in.
know, there has been a lot of questions out there if an individual wasn't employed during the entire period of time. So that does not matter. Even if they were only there part of the time, you still use the full 24 weeks. The exception to that is, and Kate, as we go through here, maybe in the Q&A we can cover it. The exception is that there are, if you terminate somebody for cause, they do not count against you, or if they voluntarily quit. So there are certain scenarios where you get to exclude them from the list, and then the mathematics doesn't. But unless they meet one of those criteria, regardless of how many weeks they actually worked during the covered period, you're dividing their hours by the full 24 weeks.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I've gotten a lot of questions on that too. And the way that the application is designed, and I'll just flip back over that real quick. On that last page where you're listing out each of the employees, your average FTE is going to be the average FTE that they actually got paid for during that time period. And then this one little box here is the FTE reduction exceptions. And that's where you'll add back any of those exceptions that Mike just mentioned, as far as if somebody was terminated for cause, or if they voluntarily resigned. So the calculator is going to kind of walk us through each of those steps. In this first step here, you will average out the actual hours that they were paid for that full time period. So if this number 10 employee, if they worked 20 hours per week for the first 12 weeks and 0 hours per week for the last 12 weeks, that's how they get to 10 average hours per week for that full 24-week period. Yep. So we've got the average FTE that then calculates out in the next column. After that, average annual salary or hourly wage rate. Now this is different than the cash compensation. The cash compensation, again, that's actual dollars that were paid or that were incurred during the period. This average annual salary or hourly wage rate is going to be what's the average salary that was in effect, the average annual salary that was in effect for that time period, or the average hourly rate that was in effect for that time period. So I bring that information in and we can look at a couple of examples. So our salaried folks, we've got 80,000, 72,000, 56,000, and 60,000. So those were the actual rates, the salary rates that were in effect for the alternative payroll covered period. And as you look over here, you can see the cash compensation obviously is less. That's different because this is the amount that was actually paid or incurred during that 24-week period. For the hourly folks, then this is the hourly rate that was in effect for the time period. So we've got 3 that were at $30 an hour and 3 that are at $25 an hour. The next column then is the average number of hours worked per week, and we're switching time periods here. So now we're looking at the first quarter of 2020. So started out looking at our alternative payroll covered period. Now we're going back and comparing to the first quarter of 2020. And this is the comparative period that we use when we look at, do we have a reduction in our compensation rate that's going to result in one of these salary or hourly wage reductions. So average number of hours worked per week. We don't need to fill that out for the salaried folks. We do need to put in that information for our hourly individuals. So let's add that in. And then our next column is the average annual salary or hourly wage rate again. So it's the same measurement that we had over here, but different time period. So one is our covered period, and then the other one is our comparative period that we're using, which is the first quarter of 2020. So let's bring that information over. Okay, and so here we can start to see some differences. So for our salaried individuals, we have for employee number 1, 80,000 was the rate in the base period, 80,000 is the rate in our covered period. So we can see in column M here that we are at 100% of compensation for our covered period as compared to our base period. We didn't have any reduction. Employee 2 then, we were down to 72,000 compared to our base of 80,000. So we're at a 90% compensation rate, or we've reduced 10%. Employee 3 then, we went from 80,000 down to 56,000. So we are at 70% of the compensation. So this individual had their compensation reduced by 30%. And you can see what happened here is now we've got some cells that are going to need to be filled in to see if we can meet a safe harbor for them. These other ones are all gray because they did not have their compensation reduced by more than 25%. It's only this one here that we need to worry about, employee number 3. So let's take a look at that one. So these next 3 columns then get into the safe harbor for compensation changes. And these dates are kind of interesting. So we start out by looking at what was the rate in effect as of February 15th. That's kind of the pre-COVID date that was selected in the CARES Act. Then we look at what was the rate that was in effect from 2/15 to 4/26. And if that decreased, we've got then the opportunity to bring that back up to the pre-COVID rate by the date that we file our application. And here we are estimating that that's 12/15. So notice that for the safe harbor, the covered period actually doesn't come into play at all. We're looking at what was the rate as of 2/15, and then how did it did it change? Did it reduce as you went through 4/26? And if so, then you have the opportunity to restore that rate and qualify for the safe harbor. For company C, their covered period doesn't even start until May 11th. So let's say that their rate was $80,000 as of 2/15, and their average rate that was in effect from 2/15 to 4/26 was 56,000. So they did have that dip. If they brought it back up to 80,000, they would have nothing for the salary hourly wage reduction. Just so we can kind of see an example of how a wage reduction does flow through, let's say that this company does not think that they're going to be able to restore that wage by 12/15. They're going to keep it at 56,000. So now we've got this error showing over here in the salary hourly wage reduction. So the reason why that's an error right now is because this is only going to calculate a compensation reduction to the extent that the compensation reduction is greater than whatever the FTE reduction is for that employee. So if you reduced their compensation by 30% like we did here, but you also reduced their FTEs, their hours that they're working and getting paid for by 30%, you're not going to get dinged again for the compensation reduction. You'll take it on the FTE side and this will come out to 0. So we haven't given the calculator yet enough information on FTEs to be able to calculate this. So right now we're showing an error. As we go and complete information on other tabs, this will come back and calculate out. So right now we've only told it what our FTEs were in the covered period. We haven't told it about the FTEs in the base period. So it doesn't know if this reduction is because we reduced FTEs or if this reduction is simply just a rate reduction. So that was a handful. There's a lot going on this tab number 3. The other ones will get easier, I promise. So let's move over now to tab 4. And this is going to be where we're going to input information on our employees that made over $100,000 in 2019. And again, this is going to be based off of looking at the most, or that highest pay period in 2019 and annualizing that out. So let's say we've got one individual that falls into this category here, and We've got employee 11. They work 40 hours per week during the payroll covered period, and we'll say that they received compensation during the covered period of $60,000. And again, you can kind of put that out week by week to help track. We'll just plug it all in at once here. Now notice as it comes over to our white column here, where it's actually pulling in the dollars that are going to get put into the forgiveness calculation, that it takes that 60,000 and limits it to 46,154. So this is that $100,000 limitation. So if you take $100,000 and prorate that down to the 24-week covered period, that's 46,154. So that's the cap that you'll be allowed to include in your calculation for forgiveness for each employee. So we've got that, and then it calculates out 1 FTE for our employee 11. So much easier on this one because you don't have to worry about all those compensation reductions. The way that the CARES Act is written, they don't really care if you changed compensation for folks that made over $100,000, these more highly compensated employees. They're really worried about the individuals that were less than 100,000. So we can move on now to tab number 5, and here we'll get into some additional details on FTEs. So first question is, did your business operate in 2019? So if the answer is no, you're going to have some areas grayed out here that deal with 2019 periods that you won't need to fill in. Company C was, we'll say yes. Were you a seasonal business? If yes, it's going to stay as it is. Our company is not, so we've got this seasonal columns that are going to gray out. We don't need to put anything in there. Now we've got some questions here to answer that will determine if we actually need to go and fill out the rest of this information. So the first one is, did you have any FTE reductions? So you'll answer no here if you can document that you did not reduce the number of employees, or you didn't reduce the number of hours paid to your employees from the beginning of the year through the end of the covered period. So if you didn't, and you can answer no, you are certifying that you have no reduction in FTEs and you don't have to actually fill this out. Our company C did have some reductions in FTEs, so we'll have to say yes here. Now you're going to come and look at question number 2 to see if you meet the first safe harbor. So this first safe harbor is one of the newer things that was more recently added with some of the guidance that came out. And this basically says, all right, if you had reductions in your FTEs, but the reason for those reductions was because you were complying with government guidelines or mandates for social distancing, safety, sanitation, etc., related to COVID-19, we're going to hold you harmless for those reductions. So we're not going to reduce your forgiveness for that. So you'll answer yes here if the reason for your FTE reductions was because you were following those federal, state, or local guidelines or mandates. Our company C, they're a no. They just had to reduce the number of hours that some of their employees were working because the overall economy was a little bit slower and they had slower business, but they couldn't exactly tie it back to one of these government mandates. So let me show you what that looks like. So if you do hit yes, again, that all becomes gray and you don't need to fill anything out there. So we're no. So we'll need to fill out this tab where we look at our FTEs by employee. And we're going to start out here with our reference periods. So the employees that we've already input don't automatically populate on tab 5 here because they're looking at different time periods. So the employees that we've input on tab 3 and tab 4, that's our employees that we had on the payroll during our covered period. On tab 5, this is our employees that were on the payroll during our reference period. Now, sure, there should be, probably in most cases, a lot of overlap, but since it's not a one-for-one, they're not really, populating over here. It's very possible that we could have some employees during our covered period that were not on the payroll during our reference period and vice versa. So let's go ahead and put our information in here. So for our company C, we're going to say that we had all of the employees that we had during our covered period. They also worked for us during our reference period. And we do have one additional employee, this employee 12, that was not on tab 3 or tab 4 for our covered period. So this is our employee that retired at the end of 2019. So we're going to include that person in here. Now, if you know that you had lower FTEs in one of these reference periods compared to the other, you can fill this out just for that reference period. But if you're not sure, fill it out for both, and the calculator will select for you the one that is most favorable. So in this case, we're not sure. So we're going to go ahead and put the hours in for both. So these are average hours that were paid per week during these various periods. So 2/15/19 to 6/30/19, we had a lot of 40 hours a week, some 20 hours, a couple more 40 here. And then the other option for reference period is 1/1/2020 to 2/29/2020. Again, a lot of 40 hours, some 20 hours, and then 40. And then we've got our retiree here who didn't work at all during 2020. Now the calculator is going to go in and it's going to, again, it's going to select for us the lowest one because we want that hurdle to be the lowest. This is our reference period that we're going to compare our covered period FTEs back to. So we want our covered period FTEs to be as high as possible in comparison to this reference period. So we want the reference period to be low, so it's the lower hurdle that we're going to have to meet or exceed. So we've got our hours in. That went ahead and calculated for us then these average FTEs for that period. We skip over seasonal. Now we look at, do we qualify for another safe harbor? So we talked about safe harbor up here, number 1. Safe harbor number 2, this is white, so it's a calculated field, and that's going to calculate based off of information we input here. So the safe harbor for FTEs, it's the same date as the safe harbor for compensation. And again, these dates don't have anything at all to do with what your covered period is. This is just dates that were selected in the CARES Act. So we're going to put in our hours during that first period. So what we had for the period including 2/15, and then we'll plug in what hours we had for those employees during that next period, that 2/15 to 4/26. And as we do that, again, we're eligible for this safe harbor if we had a reduction from 2/15 to 4/26, then we've got the opportunity to come back and cure that reduction by the date that we submit our application, which we're estimating to be 12/15. So as we look down through here, we don't have any reductions in that time period. So we know we've got some reductions, but those all happened after 4/26. Those happened during our covered period. So we actually aren't eligible to meet this safe harbor number 2. Now, if I would just change one of these to 30, we can see, okay, well now this opens up the cell over here where we've got the opportunity to bring those hours back up. But for purposes of this example, let's say that we actually didn't have our reductions taking place during the safe harbor dates, so we're not eligible for this safe harbor. One other thing I want to show you on this tab, which we kind of talked about a little bit, but these average FTEs, so we've got these 2 reference period date ranges here, and if we go to the bottom, there we go. So we can see we had 10.5 FTEs for that 2019 range and 9.5 for that 2020 range. So the calculator is selecting that we'll use the lower of those 2 9.5 as our reference period FTEs. All right, so that gets us through tab 5. Now let's look at tab 6. And this is what Mike was talking about before as far as these exceptions to those FTE reductions. And this is the tab that we get to kind of look employee by employee in their specific situation and see if they meet any of those exceptions. So on tab 5, we're looking at these safe harbors, which are kind of global safe harbors. Did you meet those? In tab 6, we're looking employee by employee in their specific situations, and do any of those on a one-off basis meet these reduction exceptions. So the first two columns here are pre-populated for us based off of the employees that are on our reference period for FTEs. So bringing over all of our employees that are going into that reference period calculation. The next one then looks at, okay, so for all those employees that you had during your reference period, were they also employed during the covered period, yes or no? So this is where it matches up based on that employee identifier between the different tabs. So all of our employees were employed during the covered period except for that employee 12, who was our retiree, so they're a no. Next one then brings over the FTEs during the covered period, so that's going to come from either tab 3, if they were an employee that made less than $100,000 in 2019, or tab 4, if they were an employee that made over $100,000. So those will both pull through here. Column H then is FTEs during the reference period. And this is going to bring over the FTEs during that selected reference period. So if we add these up, we come up to that 9.5. So it will go through and based on those two different reference periods that you put in, bring over the one that's going to be the most favorable for you. So now this next section is going to look at all of those different exceptions that are available to you to see if any one of those meet the criteria for those employees. So our first three are grayed out. We don't need to fill those out, and that's because we had no reduction in FTEs. They were 1 FTE during the reference period, 1 during the covered period, so we don't need to worry about any exceptions. Employee number 4 then, we do have a reduction. So they went from 1 in the reference period down to 0.75 during the covered period. So we take a look at if they met any of these exceptions. The first one is if we offered them their job back and they refused, they said no. So we'll say no, that's not the situation here. The next one would be, were they fired for cause? So if you terminate somebody for cause, we're not going to penalize you for this calculation. Here we're going to say no. Did they voluntarily resign? So somebody just leave on their own accord. We won't we'll say that's a no as well. Voluntary hours reduction. So did somebody kind of say, hey, you know what? This is a tough time for you. It's a tough time for me. I've got kids at home now that I need to homeschool. How about I just cut back on my hours and that will help me out and help you out? That would be one where somebody had a voluntary hours reduction. So let's say for employee 4, that's exactly what happened. Employee 4, employees unavailable. So this would be an exception if you had let somebody go or somebody left and you tried to replace them, but you were unable to find that skill set. You could have a reduction, or you could have an exception to your reduction there. So we'll say no for that one. Last column then was the position filled by a new employee. So if you had reductions for any of these reasons, but you were still able to replace that FTE by hiring somebody else or increasing somebody else's hours, you need to answer yes here. In our case, we're going to answer no. So when we did that, we have this 0.25 that populates in this FTE reduction exception column. And what that's doing is saying, all right, you've got 0.75 that they actually were paid during the covered period and are included in that Schedule A FTE number. You've got a full FTE during the reference period. So you have this 0.25 reduction, but they meet one of these exceptions. So they're going to add back then the difference between those two. So it's going to get us back to, they're going to be counted as one full FTE during the covered period. 0.75 that they actually got paid for, and then 0.25 is that reduction exception. So you broke down through that for each one of those employees. We'll say that all of these are no, just to keep things moving. All right, then we move over to tab 7. And here we've got space for our non-cash compensation as well as our non-payroll expenses. So let's just assume that we've got $25,000 of health insurance that we paid during the period, $11,000 of retirement contributions that we've made, that the company made, $2,000 for SUTA. We'll say $18,000 for the mortgage interest, $3,000 for some rent on some personal property, and then $6,000 of utilities. So this one's a quick and easy one to fill out. And again, you can go ahead and track those week by week or month by month as you make the payments. Just kind of put in totals for now. Moving on to tab 8 then is where we finally get to the owners. So owners have not been included in any of the information that we've done up to this point. Basically, the way that the CARES Act was written, it's really all about how do we give businesses money to keep employees employed. And there is a distinction between, are you an owner employee or an employee employee? So we haven't worried at all about what's going on with FTEs of owners or with compensation of owners and their reductions. Right now is the only time when we kind of get to look at the owners and include their information. So we said that this is an S Corp, so we'll put S Corp, put in our owner information, and we'll just say that we've got one. Cash compensation for 2019 is $150,000. We'll put our cash compensation for our covered period as $60,000 and an additional $10,000 in company retirement contributions. So health insurance paid by the company, that is grayed out as an S Corp. Those amounts are already included in the W-2 in that cash compensation amount, so we won't be able to include that. However, our total dollars of compensation for this owner were $70,000 for the period. But what's actually counting in our forgiveness calculation is $20,833. So this is a limitation. Again, one of the more recent guidance that has come out, our owner's compensation that is included for forgiveness is limited to $20,833. So you see that cap there. All right, so that gets us through all of the salmon colored tabs. So that's all of the tabs that require our input. So now we can take a look at our output and how we'll put those into the application itself. So let's flip back to the application. And if we go to the top, here we'll look at a little more detail of those items. So the very top section is company, just general company information. So name, address, contact information, tax identification number, etc. You will want to make sure that you use the proper legal name here and tax identification number. So the banks and the SBA both are going to be processing a lot of applications, and you don't want them to get hung up with something not quite matching up here. So take an extra minute to make sure that you've got the correct information in those boxes. The next section then is some general information about loans that you received under the CARES Act. So your SBA loan number, your lender PPP loan number, amount, date that you received it, employees, and then if you received anything for the EIDL. This information was probably provided to you when you got your loan. If not, go back, ask your lender about the loan number from themselves and from the SBA. They'll have that for you. The employees at the time of loan application and employees at time of forgiveness application. Employees here means FTEs. So you'll use that same methodology that we talked about for calculating FTEs in the forgiveness application to come up with the number of FTEs that you had on these different dates. Now, when you filled out the loan application to get the PPP to begin with, it also asked this question of the employees at the time that you applied for the loan. And when everyone was going through and filling out that application, employees wasn't really defined. So it was unclear if it meant the just raw number of headcount that you had at that time, or if it was an FTE calculation, and if so, if it was based off of 30 hours per week or 40 hours per week. So I think there was a wide variety of methodologies that people use to fill that out. Here for the forgiveness application, it has been made clear that that should be the FTEs. So you want to make sure that you calculate those both out using that same FTE methodology with the 40 hours per week. If you have a different number here for what you put on your initial application, I would say just talk with your lender and explain to them what the differences were in the methodology that you used before versus now. Shouldn't cause an issue, but it would definitely be something I would recommend kind of bringing up and just making sure that they're aware of. Next section here then is some general information that's going to impact how your calculation works. So payroll schedule, you just check off weekly, bi-weekly, etc. List out your covered period, an alternative payroll covered period if you chose to use one. And then finally, if you did get a loan over $2 million, you're going to want to check the box here. So they have stated that any loans over 2 million will be reviewed. Anything else is kind of in the lottery to potentially be reviewed. But if you do have over 2 million, you'll have to check that box. All right, as we move down then to the bottom of that first page. Again, we kind of took a quick look at this earlier, but we've got our payroll, non-payroll cost. We've got adjustments here to make for FTEs and salary and hourly wage reductions. And then we've got our potential forgiveness amounts, and then finally our actual forgiveness amount. So if we go back to our calculator and look at that first loan forgiveness tab, that first bright blue output tab, it's line for line the exact same thing. So we've got all the numbers here that would need to be translated over onto the application. Let's walk through these a little bit, and again, we'll kind of dive into a little bit more of the details. This is that real high level summary, but we've got $323,000 of payroll cost, and this would be the sum of employees over 100,000, under 100,000, and their non-cash compensation and owners. So this is kind of that all-in payroll number. Below, we've got our non-payroll costs, that mortgage, interest, rent, and utilities that we're able to count. So this is the sum total here of all of the dollars that we were eligible to claim forgiveness on. This is the total amount that we spent during that 24-week period. Next section then the total salary hourly wage reduction. And we can see we've got this $18.46 coming through. So if you remember, when we first started to fill this out and put in the information for our salary hourly wage reduction, we had that error here. So that's because we hadn't put in the FTE information yet. Well, now that we've included that FTE information for the reference period, this has calculated out, and we've got a salary hourly wage reduction of about $1,800. So that's coming through here. The next one then is total of your total eligible dollars for forgiveness minus that salary or hourly wage reduction. We get the subtotal. Now we look at the FTE reduction quotient. So 0.89. So that means we've got about 89% of our FTEs during our covered period as compared back to what we had during our reference period. And we'll see some more detail on that as we kind of go on the next couple tabs here. Our three numbers for comparison then for our forgiveness amount. The first one is that subtotal from above times that reduction quotient gets us this amount here that's a modified total. So this is all the dollars we've spent for eligible purposes for forgiveness during our 24 weeks, minus the comp reduction, minus the FTE reduction, gets us this 312. Our actual PPP loan amount to begin with was 150, and then the payroll 60% requirement was 539,000. So we spent a lot on payroll. Once we divide that out by the 60%, that gets us the 539. So again, it's the lesser of these three. That's our actual forgiveness amount, and that is the 150, so the loan amount itself. So here's an example of a company that had a small, but had a salary hourly wage reduction, and then they also had an FTE reduction, so 11% FTE reduction, and still got full forgiveness because they used that 24-week covered period and have so many dollars here that were eligible for forgiveness that even after you take out that wage reduction and that FTE reduction, you still are higher than the loan amount itself. So we're at 150 for that loan forgiveness. So again, back over to the application, those just go down line by line and you put each one of those in there. As we move on to tab 2, or sorry, page 2, we'll skip on over again. That's our certifications. So Schedule A, we go that next layer deep into the numbers. So Schedule A, we are going to break out first information on our employees that earned less than $100,000 in 2019, and we're on that table 1. Then we've got a separate section for folks that were over $100,000 are on our table 2. Then we've got the non-cash compensation, so our health insurance, retirement, and SUTA to add in. Finally, we add in our owner's compensation, and that gets us to our total payroll cost. So that total payroll cost is what rolls up into line 1 on that first page. So again, this worksheet A or Schedule A is diving down into that next layer of detail. So if we flip back to our calculator and go to that PPP Schedule A tab, we again have all of those same line items that you would be able to translate over. So our our table 1 totals are folks that were less than 100,000. We're getting total $218,000 of compensation from them and 7.5 FTEs. Our folks over $100,000, we've got total compensation of $46,000 for them and total of 1 FTE. Bring in our non-cash compensation, our owner compensation, and we get our total. So at the bottom here, we can see we've got our 9.5 FTEs from our reference period. And we looked and saw that was the lesser of those two. We had 10.5 and 9.5, so we've got 9.5 that comes through as our reference period. And then our total FTEs are 8.5. So we have 7.5 here from table 1, and then we've got 1 from table 2. And as we kind of dig down one more layer deep, we'll see how we come up to this 7.5 that's in table 1. But for now, we take the 8.5 divided by the 9.5. That gets us this reduction quotient of the 0.89, and that was what we used on the first page to reduce our potential forgiveness amount for those changes, those reductions in FTEs. All right, so back to our application. So we've kind of gotten all of that filled out. And as we go down to the bottom of Schedule A, it's going to ask us some questions here on FTE changes and safe harbors. And these actually follow right along with those FTE questions back here on tab 5. If we had a reduction, if we met the first safe harbor, if we met the second safe harbor, those are those exact same questions to be able to use that information to fill those out. The next page then is the worksheet to Schedule A. So we've got this table 1 where we're going to list out employee by employee their compensation, FTEs, and if they had any salary or hourly wage reduction. So again, we're limited here. We only have a handful of line items. We might need some more. And in case of our company C, we do need some more. So we'll go back to our calculator. And again, these kind of dark bluish gray tabs here are the ones that are going to be able to be used as attachments for that page. So we've got each of the employees, their identifier, cash compensation, FTEs for that covered period, and then if there was any salary or hourly wage reduction. So if you printed that, it would just print out with your name and the table name, and then all of the information that you would need to provide there. Now, if we go to the bottom of this, again, this mirrors just what's on our application. So on this application, we've got this one little box here for FTE reductions or reduction exceptions we get to add back in, and we've got a box 1, 2, and 3 total. So same thing over here. We've got our 0.25 that will get added back in for our FTE reduction exceptions. Our FTEs up above, and we just add up person by person. Our 7.25. We add back in the 0.25, and that's where we get our 7.5 FTEs for the folks that were under that $100,000. So you got a similar tab here for the table 2, folks that are over $100,000, and then same thing for the owners. So that will get you through the top of this page. Bottom of this page is more detail on how to calculate the second safe harbor. So you won't actually fill that out here because this is a person by person calculation. It's just kind of showing you how to do that. And again, the calculator has done all of that for you and given you the answer as to whether or not you met that safe harbor. And then we're back to that final page, which is the optional demographic information. So that gets us through the calculator, how to fill that out for the kind of long form when you've got some FTE reductions or compensation reductions that you've got to take into account, and then how that information that's coming out of the calculator gets translated over into the application itself. So I'm going to open it up now for questions and answers, and Mike's going to kind of jump back in to help us with that as well.
Thank you, Kate. Appreciate that. That was awesome. And Kate, actually, if you go back to your calculator, I guess the forgiveness calculator, early on, we had a question that really related to when do we have to use the full form versus when do we need to use the short or the easy form. This is kind of worthy of kind of walking everybody through. More often than not, when we see an easy form, we think in terms of the dollars being smaller or the employee headcount being smaller, where this is just not that. Very, very big loan, large employee group, and yet the easy might qualify. So if you wouldn't mind, when you went through the easy the other day, can you just walk through this easy, the 3 different criteria here? And I think it's going to help us out with the question as it relates to when does the easy form apply?
Yeah, and I mean, you're right. And, you know, a lot of the early conversation that was happening around this easy form, they were talking about making a dollar threshold. So if the loan was below a certain amount, it was going to say, hey, maybe it's automatic forgiveness, or maybe it's just a really streamlined form. When they came out with the easy form, didn't have anything to do at all with the dollar amount of the loan or the number of employees or what your forgiveness was going to be. But it has to do with these FTE reductions and compensation reductions. So if you don't have any FTE reductions that you've got to work through your calculation, or you don't have any compensation reductions above that 25% threshold that you've got to work through your calculation, you can use the easy form. Now, with those FTE reductions, there are some exceptions to that allow you to still have an FTE reduction and use the easy application. So we can kind of walk through these here. There are 3 different criteria, and you'll have to meet one of them. So if you meet any one of these 3, you can use the easy form. The first one is for folks that were self-employed independent contractors, didn't have any employees when they applied for the loan. So think about your folks that the information flows through their Schedule C on their tax return. So obviously, if you don't have any employees, you're not going to have any reductions in compensation or FTEs, so you're automatically in. The next one then here says, all right, first off, you can't have any reductions in your compensation rates to your employees over 25%. So if you reduced compensation rates up to and including 25%, you're still in the clear. Once you trip that 25% threshold, now you are not able to use the easy form. Now, just like I was explaining before when we were going through the calculation, this 25% reduction in compensation, this is the rate of compensation, not the hours that they're working. So if you've got somebody that made $30 an hour and they're getting paid less during the covered period because they're working fewer hours, but that $30 per hour stayed the same, that's not what we're talking about here. So we're talking about the actual rate itself. Second part of this number 2 criteria, this is a 2-parter, is getting to those hours. So if you so this is saying you didn't reduce the hours that people were working or the number of employees that you had, or if you did, and the reason that you reduced those was because you tried to rehire them and they refused, they wouldn't come back, or you couldn't find similarly skilled employees to come back and fill those positions, you can ignore that. So that's an exception, and will allow you to have that FTE reduction without making you go fill out the long form. Additionally, if you can ignore those reductions if you offered to bring them back and they refused. So there's those couple of things that you can have an FTE reduction, but if it was because you couldn't find the right skills to bring back, or you tried to bring somebody back and they said thanks but no thanks, not going to hold you harmless, or not going to hold you accountable for that. We will hold you harmless, and you can use the easy form. Third one then is even broader. It starts out the same as the second, and it says, okay, you can't have any of those compensation reductions over 25%. And then when it starts looking at the FTEs, it says, all right, you are allowed to have FTE reductions if those are because you are following those government mandates or guidelines that were put out for COVID. So something that said, your industry needs to shut down, or something that said, hey, you need to really have that 6 feet for social distancing, and you've had to reduce the number of employees that you have in working around your facility because of that social distancing, then you can qualify for that third criteria. That was long-winded, sorry, there's a lot of kind of exceptions to that one. But go check out the our WVC short video on that too for even a little bit longer explanation.
Yeah, perfect. Now that's exactly what I was looking for, Kate. So the question came through to say that during an 8-week period, we had a number of people that we hired and terminated and quit. So, but we ended up the 8 weeks with more employees. And so this is exactly what I was looking for, because unfortunately the answer to the question is it depends, right? Yeah. If the change in the FTE meets any of these definitions here from the exception, then you can still use the short or what's called the easy form. If you just terminated somebody for cause, right? That's not part of these exceptions here. So you don't get punished for that FTE, but it does effectively prevent you from using the easy form.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I mean, some of these exceptions here that allow you to still use the easy form are the same as those FTE reduction exceptions we looked at on tab 6, but they're not all on here. So yeah, terminating from somebody for cause or even a retirement. As it stands today, you can't use the easy form for those reasons. Not to say that they won't come out with a different guidance that changes that down the road, so stay tuned. But yeah, there's just only a few specific exceptions there.
So we've got a lot of questions. Most of them are actually answered privately. I've answered most of them back. So please continue to ask them, but I'll just kind of go through here. And for some of the questions that were already asked for the benefit of the group, kind of cover some concepts that we've found to be somewhat, I guess, far reaching, right? They're just applying to a lot of people. So actually, we just had a question coming in as far as businesses and LLC. So the owner really doesn't get a paycheck. Do they have to be included in the calculator loan? Let me answer this one kind of two ways. So as it relates to what you include in the calculator for forgiveness, you're really not required to include anything. If you choose to have interest payments and exclude it, or rent and exclude it, or for that matter, payroll and exclude it, there's not really a requirement to include it. Our suggestion, as far as if the objective is to achieve 100% forgiveness, then you really want to include everything that you can. So if we say, okay, we want to include the owner, but really doesn't get a paycheck. So this whole notion of payroll cost and the paycheck doesn't quite resonate with me. Well, when they went through the CARES Act, they really wanted this to apply to everybody. And if you're a business owner, well, you are getting a paycheck. It just doesn't come in the form of a W-2. Sometimes it can come in the form of you just have a Schedule C on your tax return. Or sometimes if you're a partner in a partnership, you can just get a K-1 from that partnership. So essentially what the IRS or what the SBA and Treasury has landed on as relates to owners is if you have a W-2 from 2019, then basically it is the lesser of 2.5 months times, if you're in the 24-week period, the lesser of 2.5 months times your 2019 W-2, or $20,833. If you do not have a W-2, so we're talking about a partnership or a C Corp, and Kate's actually pointing to it right there, then you take your 2019, if you're a Schedule C taxpayer, then your 2019 form Schedule C out of your tax return. Or if you are a partner, then you go back to your K-1, and essentially box 1 on the K-1 is going to have ordinary earnings. Now, there's a little bit of a nuance that it's the ordinary earnings times this 93.285% as far as self-employment tax. But for purposes of this answer, you do have, as an owner, earned income from 2019, and you really need to base what you're paying yourself off of 2019. So you can't pay yourself more than what you made in 2019, with that max still being that $100,000. But you don't get the $100,000 for the full 24 weeks. You only get the $100,000 for a 2.5 month equivalent. And basically the reason for that is that they didn't want to provide owners a benefit for essentially laying folks off. They got a loan for 2.5 months. If they could get a loan for 2.5 months, but then pay themselves more than 2.5 months, there's scenarios where it'd be advantageous for an owner to lay somebody off. So they said, well, let's make this neutral and max out what you can pay yourself during the 24 weeks to the same 2.5 month basis that you actually got the loan on. So anyway, very long-winded answer, covered a couple different things there, but as it relates to an owner, your Schedule C or your K-1 from 2019 really is your W-2. It is your paycheck.
And just one clarifying point there. So you're not limited as to how much you can pay yourself during that time period. You are limited to what is going to count for forgiveness during that pay period. So pay yourself what you need to pay yourself and what makes sense for your business. But for purposes of calculating your forgiveness, you'll be maxed out at that $20,833, or your 2019 equivalent if that was less.
Thank you for that clarification, Kate. Yeah. So if I go through a couple of other, we have had these kind of FTE exception questions. So Kate, you would kind of run through the FTEs. So we've got this question in the past as far as, so we've got these truck drivers who are paid by a load, right, versus an hour. There really is not formal guidance out there for this scenario. what our suggestion has been is, so 40 hours, everybody gets to agree that 40 hours is kind of a reasonable amount and expectation of full-time per week. So my suggestion, if you're in this scenario where you really don't have hours at some other measure, determine what's the equivalent of 40 hours. So if for a truck driver, if 3 loads a day is kind of max, or kind of what you would expect to be a full day, then I think it's reasonable to say, okay, a 5-day week is 15 loads. And so if you're going to go through the whole FTE calculation using 40 hours, then go through the FTE calculation conceptually just using 15 loads per week and really work through that. Not saying that that's kind of formal guidance, but in the absence of any guidance, I would tell you that that's at least a reasonable approach towards that. Just had another question come in. I have an employee that was on maternity leave during our loan period for 24 weeks. She took 6 weeks unpaid. Is there a safe harbor on the salary reduction? That is a very interesting on that maternity leave. What do you think, Kate? Does that qualify under this voluntary? Because if you voluntarily reduce your time, then you're not going to count as a negative in the FTE calculation. Seems like maternity leave, I guess I'd make the argument to say this was, you voluntarily took some time off. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm thinking the same thing. You know, the way the question is posed, saying, is there a safe harbor for that on the compensation? And again, this is where it gets really confusing. And I kind of have to keep reminding myself of this, right? To not confuse what's changing on compensation versus what's changing on hours that you're working and getting paid for, right? So the first question is going to be, always go back to the FTEs first and look at, is something changing in the hours that you're getting paid for? So in this case, they're working 0 hours, so they're getting paid 0, but they're getting paid 0 not because you changed their compensation rate, but because they're working less. So you will default back first to looking at what happened with FTEs, see if they run through, qualify for any of those FTE reduction exceptions. I would agree with you, Mike, that this is a voluntary hours reduction, and maternity leave would meet that. And then those compensation reductions are only to the extent that they're above and beyond the FTE reduction. So in this case, you wouldn't have any additional compensation reductions. I think you just kind of go back to the FTEs.
Yep, makes sense. Yeah, but I mean, that is an excellent point in ensuring that we're keeping the salary reduction and the FTE reduction completely separate. And you're right, they're a bit of a different mindset, that somebody working 0 hours a week, but had they worked an hour, would have been paid the same rate, is an FTE reduction, but is not a salary or rate reduction.
Yep.
So we've had a couple of questions here as opposed to as it relates to independent contractors. So this is a concept that got really confused from the very, very beginning. When the CARES Act first came out, everybody read it and said, oh my goodness gracious, independent contractors count as it relates to salary. They count as our salary cost. And then when we finally got kind of clearance or clear on what the SBA and Treasury meant, what the CARES Act really meant, it meant those independent contractors are able to file for a PPA loan themselves. So their own income, really going back to that Schedule C taxpayer, or somebody that's in a partnership and they're getting I guess a K-1. So as it relates to a company that has a staffing agency providing folks, or just a company that has independent contractors working for them, they do not get to include the independent contractors in their own payroll cost. The independent contractors themselves should be able to file for their own PPP loan. So we had that question come up a couple times here. Not being able to use the short form, even though we terminated during the payroll cover or hire replacement, and we ended up with more employees. Yeah, so this is going back to those exceptions, and it really, Katie, if you can go back to that easy form application, it really gets to average employees reductions. Yeah, so if you were unable to hire that same employee because they just refused to come back, or if you were unable to hire just any employee because of similar qualifications, that would count. But just simply terminating somebody, even terminating them for cause, and then turning right around and hiring another employee, even hiring another 2 or 3 employees back. So you actually end up the covered period with more people. As this is currently written, you are not allowed to use the easy form under that fact pattern. It just doesn't fit any of these 3 criteria here. That covers the lion's share of the questions that we had. Let me make sure, can a residential landlord apply for PPP funds? It really is going to depend upon the business model. If you have multiple properties and potentially you have a property manager, potentially have a couple of employees that are going around and maintaining and fixing properties, and you actually have W-2 payroll, then yes, that residential landlord would be able to apply for the PPP loan based on the W-2 salaries that they're sending out to individuals. As far as your income from rental income is not earned income. Rent income by definition in the IRS is passive income. So if we're talking about that income replacement for you, just yourself as it flows through, it just rent income does not qualify. But if you as a business model do have people that are on the payroll, you could get something for the folks that are on the payroll. So we've reached our 90 minutes here. Jessica, do you have anything else for us?
I think that covers everything. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Please, keep your eyes open for our follow-up email, which will have a recording of the session, along with some additional resources, directions to those resources. I'd like to thank Mike and Kate for all your insight in answering questions, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their day.